Hey, I'm Luke Andrews, and today I want to show you how to change out your lower bearing unit without removing the chain from your ditcher. The ditcher behind me is in early stages of bearing failure due to impact of concrete entering your field. What we want to do is simulate field work or shop work and removing this bearing out of this unit. We want to loosen the jam nut of the idler tension screw. We're using a 3/4 inch boxed in end wrench. Once jam nut is loosened, remove idler tension screw. We're going to remove the cutter head completely out of our way. Take the excess weight also off the shaft as we remove it. We're using a 1 1/8 inch socket. This is a newer style cutter head. It has 5 cutting blades. The older style has 4. There's 4 bolts for the old style and 5 for the new one. After removing all your cutter head bolts, remove the head out of your way. The next step you want to do is remove your jam nuts on the front and the rear collar. To remove this jam nut, what we're going to use is an Allen wrench socket style. It's a 7/32 Allen wrench. These are usually on there pretty good after hours of use. It's going to take some torque to remove it. We'll do the same thing for the back as well. Next step is to remove your drain plug and drain out all your fluids. We recommend a ratchet Allen wrench. This is a 5/16 Allen wrench. This particular drain bolt has been stripped. Don't worry, just simply remove one of your plate bolts and fluid will drain out of this hole as well. Once all your oil is drained, finish removing the rest of your bolts. After the last bolt, the bottom plate should fall. Simply set it aside and move to your next step. The next step after you've drained your fluids and removed the bottom cover is to get a 3/4 inch box end wrench or 3/4 inch ratchet. You remove both collars, front and rear on ditcher. Alright, after you remove your front flange bolts, come to the back of your ditcher and remove the rear. This little O-ring needs to come off too. Now, what we need to do to get inside the ditcher, we want to replace it on its back just for easier access for us. So we're going to take a 15/16 wrench to unbolt your skid. On the older style ditchers, the skid is mounted up front. The new style, the skid is mounted in the back. Undo these bolts and pull your pin and remove your back skid. Once rear skid is removed, safely place ditcher on its back. Secure ditcher where it won't fall or cause injuries. This will allow you easy access to the bottom sprocket. There are 2 set screws holding the bottom sprocket in place. The set screw we use tool is a 1/4 inch Allen wrench on a socket drive. If you find the keyway, in there are 2 set screws in this one hole. This is just to make sure the set screw does not back out and the sprocket moves around. Remove both set screws from the keyway and from the other side. This will allow the sprocket to slide on the shaft freely. Now, all the set screws are removed. The sprocket should move freely on the shaft. Now it's time to remove the rear bearing. Now that you've taken the set screws out of your 22 tooth sprocket on the bottom, we want to stand the ditcher back upright. You loosened the set screw on this rear collar in previous steps. Now we want you to get you a punch and a nice size hammer. Not in the set screw hole, but in the hole that is already on the collar. Place your punch in it and hit to one side. This should free your collar up. After your collar is removed, inspect to where your set screw set. This needs to be flat to allow the bearing to slide over with ease. We recommend take a file or some sandpaper just on this spot before you slide this off. You want this to be smooth to the touch. Next is we're going to need to drive the shaft through the rear bearing and the collar. We actually have a punch here that is used. You can use a punch, or if you have a softer hammer, you can hit directly on the shaft. We don't want you to hit too much because you'll knock the edges out of your shaft and you're never going to back to your bearing. There comes the rear bearing. A couple more hits. Now, there's your rear bearing. We're going to need to remove this rear flange, put another seal on it as well. We're going to go ahead and continue on pushing the shaft out the front. This will allow the front bearing and output shaft to come along with it. Okay, so we turn the ditcher so you can see it. Sometimes this shaft will come on out the sprocket. Sometimes you have to keep punching it out with your punch. But I'm going to try to pull it straight out. Came out. Came out with your seal and your bearing and flange. Next is to remove your keyway from here and slide your front bearing off. Okay, we remove the snap ring that holds the bearing up in place. For sake of the video, we've cut the flange out of our way in order to be able to have a clear shot to show you what needs to be done next. This collar and this bearing interlock together. I have a new one here to show you what I'm talking about. If you see this bearing race, you got the thin side and you have a thick side. What this collar does, see it's got a lip on this side and it's flat on that side. It works together, and you'll see on your existing ditcher there is actually a tool mark of where this collar locked this bearing into place. And you'll see, as I turn this, you'll see how the hole would be. If there was a shaft in there, this hole would be getting smaller, which would tighten it onto this shaft. So before you can release the locking collar here, you have to hit it the opposite direction of the tool mark. And what I mean by that is take you a heavy duty punch, and you can see the tool mark that this collar was locked in that direction. So what I'm going to do is drive it back the opposite direction to unlock it. Okay, now that we have the locking collar loosened, we have it secured in a vise. Keep in mind not to damage your shaft, because this bearing has to slide back off of it. So now what I'm going to do is just attempt to tap the bearing down and off the shaft. Now, I'm going to set it on this mat and hammer it the rest of the way out also. Okay, now we're going to get the shaft ready for a new bearing. So you have two small O-rings that need to be replaced. There's one. And there's two. What I'd like to do is make sure that now you want to be in a contaminant-free zone. You would like your shaft and everything else clean before you start going on with your new parts. You don't want any kind of grit or any contaminants in this. Okay, now we're going to go on with all our new parts and new assemblies. We do have a new flange. We had to cut the other one out for video's sake, just so it wouldn't interfere with being able to show you how to remove that bearing. So there's our new flange on there. Our new O-ring. Kind of hang on to it where it won't get caught up in your snap ring groove and your top O-ring groove. Make sure it's good and flush inside your shaft there. Now, here comes the important part of reassembling this ditcher. Your locking flange end, see there's two different ends. If you recall, this odd shape, when you get it in there, it's going to slide in that flange, and we're going to spin that flange to where it locks it on the shaft. So this is a very crucial point. Sometimes you might have to take a small hammer and just barely tap the, not on the bearing, but on the race itself. Just kind of walk it down the shaft. And don't get in a hurry. That's when you damage your bearing. You have to start all the way over, or either it doesn't last as you're making the repair on. Probably wouldn't hurt to add a little lube, a little bit of oil to it as you go down. There it goes. Now you see it is flush inside that collar. You see it bouncing on it. So now what I'm going to do is take my punch, and it doesn't matter which direction you spin this. Earlier I stated look at your tool mark and spin it the opposite way. That was just to help you figure out an easier path of least resistance. You can go either way when tightening or locking this, because if you do this step again later on down the road, it'll only go one direction so far, so you know to back it off the other way. So what I'll do now, put my punch in there. Now, that bearing is locked in there. We're going to go back to our set screw, and you want to add Loctite. every set screw you reinstall, you want to add Loctite. We're going back on with our 7/32 Allen wrench. Get that where you can see it. Snug that up real good. Now, okay, we didn't mess with this gasket, so we're going to leave all that the same. Now that we have the bearing and the flange and the lock collar all in place, we got to slide our snap ring back down in its groove. See it kind of walking it down now. Be careful not to scar your shaft. I could have come on a little bit further with the snap ring, but I like to get it right there where you can hear it actually go in its groove. Sometimes you might have to tap it with a small hammer just to get it flat. And that's in the groove. Now, we're going to slide our O-ring over, and this is an important part. Our current sprocket, this is a new sprocket, I got it just to show you. Inside there, it's kind of hard to see, it's dark inside there. I have, the sprocket is hanging in the chain, and I have positioned your keyway to be straight up and down. That way, when we insert the shaft, let me put this keyway on. Put this keyway back in, it won't be any guessing game of which direction I need to hold the shaft. So it should slide right back in. Now we're ready to put our seal in place and tighten down on our bolts. Alright, now that you got this started in there, you want to take your O-ring, slide it over your bearing. After that, take your new flange, or your flange, and make sure it's a good fit over that O-ring. Then you can put your nuts back on. We're using a 3/4 inch socket to tighten these nuts. We're not going to tighten it just yet though. We're going to get them hand tight to where it won't pop back out and our O-ring won't come off our bearing, so we can have some play in the back to be able to put the rear bearing on. Okay, move to the back now. Okay, now we're at the back of the ditcher. This is why we left the front not quite tight, so we can have some room to play. I want to scrape off all the old gasket and raised surfaces that's left over from the old gasket. Now, just want to make sure there's no contaminants in here too. I'm going to wipe it down real good. Make sure you got a good seal for your gasket. Okay. Got a new O-ring that's going to slide right in the screw. Make sure it's good and flush all the way around, so when you go on with your bearing you don't pinch it. Here is a new gasket. These are all machine punched. If you look close, you'll see the punch of the machine went in that direction. It's flat back here, but the punch enters that way. An easy way, instead of fighting against it, is to go in the way the machine punched it onto your bolts. That way the gasket will slide almost effortlessly where it needs to go. Just ensure that the gasket is good and flat against the housing before insertion of the collar. We're going to put on our new collar flange. Once again, here's a very important tip. As you remember, the bearing is thin on this side and thicker on that side. And there's a groove for the locking collar to slide into. This also, just like on the other side, locks the collar and the bearing onto the shaft. Our bearings, I didn't change out the one in front. The collar was in good shape. This is the one that was on the back. It's actually in pretty good shape too. But since it's off, I'm going to go ahead and change it. We have, each bearing comes with a brand new collar. So I'm going to insert this bearing to where that cutout groove is towards the back of the ditcher. Meanwhile, I'm on the front with my other hand balancing the output shaft. So that's solid. Now, I'm going to take my other new large O-ring, just like we did the front, and make sure it's all the way around your ditcher bearing. Now, slide my flange on and hand tighten these nuts as well. My next step is to tighten the front flange bearings where it pushes everything forward so we can put our locking collar in position. Alright, I have tightened up the front collar, and now it's time for the rear. The reason I didn't tighten it up back here is I didn't want to compromise that O-ring of the bearing or anything sliding as I tighten the back. Now we can tighten up the back here. Now it's time for our locking collar. You see how easy it goes on there? And then when you give it a twist, see how it locks it in? So I'm going to lock it in. I'm rotating the other side with my hand. And I want to hit down on that keyhole there with my punch. Kind of at an awkward angle. Now, I'm going to rotate the collar back up, get my 7/32 Allen wrench, and tighten the set screw. Now, we're ready to go to the inside and set the sprocket. Okay, now we're looking in from the bottom. This is the top, the cutting head. This is the back of the ditcher. It's laying on its back. You want this sprocket to be completely to the back. I'm just going to stick this rod in there and give it a bump to make sure it's to the back of the ditcher. Now, you also want to turn, rotate till you find your keyway. And make sure your keyway is pushed down, not quite level with the sprocket, but far enough to where you won't have any problems with your set screw landing on your keyway. The keyway itself takes 2 set screws, and your other set screw is only going to take 1. The double set screw is just to ensure that the main locking set screw does not back out. So you have 2 on your keyway and 1 single on the side of the shaft. Alright, I'm going in with the first set screw on the keyway. This is probably your most important one out of the 3, because this is the one that's going to hold your keyway in place and make sure your sprocket does not dance on the shaft. Now I'm adding my second one to ensure it doesn't back out. I actually get calls sometimes of guys that have done this and they're like, how do you keep that keyway from backing out? And this is how. You just add a second sprocket, a second lock nut to the, on top of this first one. And now we'll rotate and get my shaft. Okay, now what we're going to do is make sure no contaminants here, and we're going to give this a good wipe down. And get ready for our new gasket. The old one, it wasn't in bad shape, but we're here. We recommend that you go ahead and replace it and make sure there's no contaminants on this one as well. So you see there's still some debris here from the old one. I'm going to clean this off and put this new gasket on there. Same principle goes with the machine punched. You can see that it was punched this direction. So I'm going to slide it. I'm going to put in 1 corner each on the gasket and slide that on there and get them started on my ditcher body. Okay, I've cleaned the area off and I've got my gasket. It's just sitting on here. I'm going to add 1 bolt that direction and 1 on the far corner. Got a good nice fit. I'm going to hand tight these 2. I'm actually going to hand tight all the way around this unit before I go to tighten it. Okay, before we stand the ditcher upright, you'll see the output shaft has a raised lip here. What we're going to do is we're going to reattach our cutter head. It's actually got a groove here that's going to sit right on that raised lip. Makes it easier for putting your cutter head on while it's laying in this flat position. versus wrestling it when it's in the upright. We're just going to get all our nuts, bolts started. Then we can stand it up in the upright position and tighten our bolts down. Okay, we've tightened up the head, and now it's time to mount our rear skid plate back into position. This nut size and bolt head size is 15/16. Okay, we're going to reinstall our idler screw. We want to back your jam nut back just about to the end of your bolt, that way it won't interfere with you adjusting your idler sprocket. You'll feel it starting to lift the idler sprocket back into place. Getting pretty hard to turn by hand now. I'm going to use a crescent wrench. Basically, you just want to snug it. You don't want to get it too tight. But a good idea is to maybe over tighten it and then back off to make sure nothing's in a bind or no. For some reason, some grit left on the chain and it's not allowing you to get it where you want it to be. And you can see I was able to get a couple of easy turns out of it. But I can feel it kind of getting snug right there. That's a good snug fit. So what I'm going to do is take my 3/4 inch jam nut, 3/4 inch end wrench, put on my jam nut, and I'm going to hold my socket. Okay, we've added our 3 quarts of oil. This ditcher is ready for use. We hope that some of these tips that we showed you and shortcuts will help you change your lower bearing unit out without removing the chain or sprocket. These are the original gloves I started with. This job is not as messy as some people make it to be. If you have any questions, go visit us at www.amcomfg.com. You can also find our parts manuals or literature for our newer units on there as well. Thank you.